Hi folks, welcome to RJA Impact. As well as civil private cases that are running through the courts at the moment against Sam Bankman-Fried, there are 3 government-issued indictments, 2 civil and 1 criminal. I'm going to do a shortish video on each one so that you have the whole picture as to what Sam Bankman-Fried is currently facing. So this will be a 3-part series and I'll run through each indictment in each one. I'll do a very quick summary of all 3 indictments at the start of each part of this 3-part series. So firstly, we have a civil case brought by the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. This one is very good for an understanding of the background as to exactly what SBF, FTX and Alameda were doing, and it provides a historical narrative. So I'll go through this one as part 1 of the series. It really does underline just how brazen SBF was in the face of increasing adversity and just how far he was prepared to go in breaking the law and SEC regulations in trying to further his empire and personal wealth. This, therefore, is covered in part 1 of this 3-part series. Secondly, there is a government-led prosecution alleging a number of criminal actions. It's split into 8 counts. 1 to 4 are for wire fraud, 5 and 6 are for securities and commodity fraud, and 7 is for money laundering, and finally 8 is a bit different. This is for fraud against the United States of America itself for activities against the political system. That one's going to be interesting to unpack. At the moment, this is the indictment where SBF is going to face real jail time. And this is covered in part 2 of this 3-part series. Thirdly, there is another civil case brought by the CFTC, that's a Commodities Futures Trading Commission. This has 2 counts of fraud and delves into the commingling of customer funds and the relationship with Alameda, as well as market manipulation. And this one is covered in part 3 of this 3-part series. Before I get into the substance of this indictment, if you didn't know already, Sam Bankman-Fried set up his own companies in the crypto world. Firstly Alameda, which traded, and secondly FTX, which acted as a crypto exchange. By his late 20s, SBF was worth over $30 billion. However, in late 2022, his whole empire collapsed and allegations of massive frauds and mismanagement were uncovered, leaving what is currently understood to be an $8 billion black hole and over 1 million FTX users wondering if they've lost all their money. Let's get to it. So this indictment has been brought by the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's a civil action and the complaint summary starts with an allegation of fraud against the investors in FTX and customers of FTX. And the fraud wasn't just something that happened at the end in adverse conditions. This was a massive years-long fraud, as it puts it here. And not just a little bit of money, billions of dollars. While portraying himself with this responsible persona, he was from the very start diverting funds to Alameda and making undisclosed venture investments, lavish real estate purchases, and large political donations. He hid and was secretive about this, obviously, but the statements were false, as it says here. But this is what was rumoured, and we have now seen a direct allegation. Alameda was exempted from the risk mitigation measures with a virtually unlimited line of credit, and that is key to the whole implosion that took place during 2022. So when the market crashed in May 2022, Alameda's lenders started asking for their money back. And how did Alameda achieve that? Well, it's alleged here that SBF had transferred billions of dollars to FTX. It apparently had already transferred billions and then decided to transfer billions more. And here in note 5, you can see this wasn't just FTX's money, this was FTX's customers' money. And by the way, why don't we just use our customer funds to give ourselves and some of our executives some nice loans as well? Obviously, this wasn't sustainable and the whole thing crashed in November 2022. In this violation section, we see the codes that are alleged to have been violated, and also the start of what the government is asking for is a restraint on Sam Bankman-Fried's ability to do business in this crypto sphere. There's some more on that in the next section. So here in part 1, they're asking for Sam Bankman-Fried to be restrained from doing any business in activities related to these allegations. Disgorge his ill-gotten gains, a great phrase. In other words, give the money back. Oh, and while we're at it, we want interest and civil penalties to be paid as well. A ban from being an officer and a director, and getting involved in any securities or crypto asset exchanges. And finally, anything else we or the courts can think of. Jurisdiction, defendant, not much to add there. Relevant entities, here it mentions FTX and Alameda. We know that FTX started in Hong Kong and then moved to the Bahamas. There are a couple of other people mentioned in these sections, Gary Wang and Nishad Singh, who were part of the initial setup of FTX. And here in the Alameda section, it mentions Caroline Ellison. Now, we've seen no indictments against any of these players, and I'm sure this will all unfold in due course. Here in the Alameda research section, we have another mention of a co-CEO of Caroline Ellison, at one point anyway, Sam Trabucco. The facts. This is the interesting section where they paint the whole story, so let's go through this. So in 2017, Bankman-Fried and Wang founded Alameda. Now, I believe Wang has 10% of Alameda and Bankman-Fried had the other 90%. Alameda began trading, doing arbitrage strategies, and then went on to do some yield farming. And if you want, I'll explain what that is in the notes below. Just leave me a comment. This bit's key to this whole blurred division between whose assets were whose at what point, and the extent to which Sam Bankman-Fried just saw it all as one big pot he could dip into at will. At times, Alameda sheds office space and employees with FTX. And interesting, Bankman-Fried remained the ultimate decision maker at Alameda. Well, so what are they purporting Caroline Ellison was doing, who was apparently the CEO at that time? Bankman-Fried, Wang and Singh founded FTX in May 19. Here we see some of the activities that a crypto exchange undertakes. And again, putting Bankman-Fried right at the top, he was the ultimate decision maker at FTX. We got to over 100 entities with Bankman-Fried at the top and Alameda, his crypto hedge fund, at the center. So here we get to the start of what the government is making out to be an ongoing systematic fraud. From the start, contrary to what FTX investors and trading customers were told, Bankman-Fried continually diverted FTX customer funds to Alameda. And he was pulling in the funds from investors. 8 million in August 2019, 1 billion in July 2021, 420 million in October 2021, and 500 million as recently as January 2022. And all this was from approximately 90 investors. And it goes on to say again that he failed to disclose to FTX investors the diversion of FTX customer funds to Alameda, which he then used for his own purposes, including loans to himself. And this is key. He's giving Alameda special treatment, a line of credit, and an ability to carry a negative balance sheet on its FTX customer accounts. Essentially what that means, therefore, is if Alameda wanted to do a trade, say, and it couldn't afford it, it didn't have enough assets to do the trade, FTX essentially said, don't worry, we'll cover it for you. We'll just use our money to help you do your trade. And therefore Alameda ends up owing FTX money. And boy, did it owe money. It was billions. And as part of the fraud and to be able to get away with this, Bankman-Fried was misrepresenting the risk profile of investing in FTX. Look at this sentence. Most crucially, Bankman-Fried used Alameda to house FTX customer assets and to deploy these assets under Bankman-Fried's directions to help grow his empire. Let me make an analogy here to make that clear. So let's say you have some money and you go to your local bank and deposit it into an account in your name, and then you find out that the CEO of the bank has actually dipped into your account, taken the money, and given it to his own personal company. Or you might say, put it into his own pocket. And it comes down to this sentence here: there was no meaningful distinction between FTX customer funds and Alameda's own assets. There isn't a huge amount about his lavish spending, with all of this wealth he had. But they make this point: he uses Alameda as his personal piggy bank and buys luxury condominiums, but also, key, supports political campaigns. This point about the political campaigns is really key, and we will see some more of that when we look at the government indictment in part 2. So the next piece shows you just how brazen he was, and it took me a bit by surprise that he did this. What he did was set up some bank accounts in Alameda's controller name, and then when customers came to FTX to put their money into FTX to essentially do their own trading or whatever, he actually gave them the numbers of Alameda's own bank account. So he didn't even bother putting the money into FTX and then transferring it to Alameda. He just got the money paid straight to Alameda. I'm guessing he thought, oh, it just saves the hassle of a second step in the process. Wow. And he hid this by using unusual names like North Dimension and so on to avoid the scrutiny, I guess. And internally, there was some shenanigans going on as well. Instead of calling the account with Alameda, Alameda, like anybody else would, they called it fiat@ftx.com, trying to obfuscate and hide the fact that it related to Alameda. And they hid this and didn't disclose it to investors. Oh, and this grew to a very substantial balance and no interest was paid on it. Here we have the number 8 billion. So this was Alameda's debt to FTX at one point in time, 2022. Whoops, internally they moved this liability account to another account which accidentally started to charge interest, and so Bankman-Fried had it moved again so it wouldn't be charged interest. This section, the FTX platform, is really a little bit of a repeat of some of the things I've already covered or have already been covered in this indictment. All these exemptions that Alameda had. So it was allowed to have a negative balance, it was allowed to have a line of credit that was increased based on Bankman-Fried's say-so, and an exemption from the auto liquidation requirements. So when in May 2022 crypto assets started dropping and Alameda didn't have enough money essentially to cover those repayment obligations, Bankman-Fried essentially allowed Alameda to take the money from FTX. And at that point, billions of dollars of customer funds were moved to Alameda. Get this, because Alameda now had billions of dollars more in liability to FTX, on top of the $1 billion reflected in the fiat@ftx.com account, Bankman-Fried, concerned that this enormous liability would alarm Alameda's lenders, directed Alameda to hide this line of credit in Alameda's balance sheet. Wow. And what was he saying to investors at the time? Oh, FTX customer assets are secure. Bankman-Fried has commented on this a couple of times evasively, in my opinion, since the bankruptcy. But here it talks about the terms of service in FTX with customers saying, title at all times to your assets shall remain with you and not transferred to FTX. Well, they could have possibly saved on some paper and ink because that clause was essentially ignored at all times from what this indictment says. And what's FTX telling the public? At all times, it segregates customer assets from its own assets across our platforms. In other words, a big fat lie. That was on its website, and it also promoted a similar statement in its particulars to investors. In the audited financial statements, there is no information about Alameda's undocumented line of credit. This actually might be a concern for the auditors because with deep pockets and insurance, it's possible that they fall under the line of fire for any potential lawsuits that take place. The current CEO has expressed substantial concern as to the information presented in these audited financial statements. Too right. This is interesting. I'm sure the prosecutors must have a statement by some employer or other, but it says here that Bankman-Fried directed FTX and Alameda employees to say that Alameda received no preferential treatment from FTX To Wall Street, there are no parties that have privileged access. Another big fat lie, it looks like. FTX had poor controls, promoting something to the outside world that internally really wasn't a reality. Here we see some of the famous names that FTX managed to get to endorse them. Tom Brady, MLB, Gisele Bündchen, Steve Curry, Miami Heat. FTX has the cleanest brand in crypto. This section talks about the automated risk engine. Essentially, this was software that monitored customers' positions, and if they turned into losses, it would automatically either sell the position or sell the customer's assets to cover the losses. And the point it's making here that he submitted this to the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, but it was misleading because of the omission, because Bankman-Fried did not reveal that the automatic risk engine didn't apply to the accounts of its most important customer, Alameda. In Fried's own words, what happened happened, and if I had been spending an hour a day thinking about risk management on FTX, I don't think that would have happened. Well, I think that's irrelevant because he was the one that was circumventing and bending all the rules. The valuation of Alameda's collateral. If you'll remember, one of the things that FTX did was issue its own token called FTT, and FTX provided a lot of FTT to Alameda. Now that has to have a value, and obviously to shore up or provide collateral for loans, the value needs to be sufficient to cover it. So there's an incentive to value that as high as possible. So what does it say here? Firstly, FTT token was illiquid. That's right, you couldn't sell all of the FTT at any one point in time, otherwise the price would collapse and therefore the price that you had assigned to it would be much less in actuality. So not only were they pushing the envelope to use FTT to collateralize loans, they actually told another big fat lie because he falsely told certain investors that FTX had no exposure to FTT. So here we have the point that the commingled funds were used not only to support Alameda's bad trading, but to provide loans to executives, including none other than Sam Bankman-Fried. He used the commingled funds to make large political donations and purchase tens of millions of dollars in Bahamian real estate for himself, his parents, and other FTX executives. Singh and Wang also coolly took about $750 million between them in loans. And despite all of these concrete controls that Fried was purporting to the outside world, apparently these loans were poorly documented and sometimes not even documented at all. Wow. Of course, none of that was in the financial statements or disclosed to investors. So here's an interesting take. Despite the precarious financial position of FTX and Alameda, Fried continued to use customer assets to rescue distressed crypto firms and to further mislead investors. And the point the government is making here is that Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX were really no white knights. What Bankman-Fried was doing in rescuing, for example, BlockFi, as it mentioned here, is painting a message to the wider world and investors that we are a healthy company who's got assets enough to do this, a real Machiavellian take on the whole situation. Even as late as September 22, Bankman-Fried continued to make false statements to investors. For example, in one presentation, outside of BlockFi, we didn't increase our exposure to crypto. A flat lie. Even right at the end where things were really out of control, he continued to maintain a false picture of the company. So remember, the company went bankrupt on November the 11th. So it says here on November the 2nd, CoinDesk made public this large position in FTT. On November the 6th, this is the CEO of Binance, Changpeng Zhao. He announced he was going to sell his reserves in FTT. This created a run on FTX, so the customers started to withdraw funds. To try and make things look good, Caroline Ellison tweeted an offer to buy Binance's entire stake for $22 a token. I wonder whether there's a paper trail from Bankman-Fried to Ellison requesting she did that, or did she do it herself? That would be interesting to find out. And despite all that, Bankman-Fried tweets, FTX is fine, assets are fine, FTX has enough to cover all client holdings. We don't invest client assets, even in treasuries. We have processed all withdrawals and will continue to be ... The tweet was false and misleading, and Bankman-Fried later deleted it. November the 8th, the company paused customer withdrawals and FTT plummeted by 80%. I've dug out the current price that I can find here. Bankman-Fried started looking around for investors who could bail him out and went to Binance, who said that they were looking to help out. After one day, Binance pulled out, as we know. As a result of corporate due diligence, as well as the latest news reports regarding mishandled customer funds and alleged US agency investigations, we have decided that we will not pursue the potential acquisition. So in trying to get support, Bankman-Fried approaches other investors as well and sends them a spreadsheet with a balance sheet on it. And read this if you understand it the same way as I do. It listed a negative 8 billion entry labelled as a hidden, poorly internally labelled fiat account. So is this comment saying that whole statement was on this document that Bankman-Fried said to investors? It says hidden, poorly internal label, or do you think it just said fiat account at the end? I'm finding it difficult to read that one way or another. As it says here, we know that it actually represents the amount due from Alameda. On November the 9th, Ellison does not allow Bankman-Fried to get any plausible deniability when she says that she, Bankman-Fried, Wang and Singh were all aware that FTX customer funds had been used by Alameda. November the 10th, the day before bankruptcy, Bankman-Fried tweets, "I'm sorry, that's the biggest thing. I F up and should have done better." And Alameda was winding down trading. He also said that FTX International currently has a total market value of assets/collateral higher than client deposits. Clutching at straws springs to mind. So what does the SEC want? A permanent restraint from violating Section 17A of the Securities Act. That is saying that Sam Bankman-Fried may not benefit in any way from all of these falsehoods and misrepresentations, etc., the fraud in other words. So if Bankman-Fried has gained personally anywhere, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to give it up. Similar, give up all your assets and interest of all ill-gotten gains. On top, civil monetary penalties, a bar from being an officer or a director. A ban from participating either directly or indirectly in any issuance, purchase, offer or sale of any securities. And anything else that we might think of. Okay, that was a little bit longer than I first anticipated, but I think it was useful to go through the facts as the SEC has laid them out. If you would consider hitting that subscribe button and liking the video, I would be very much appreciative of that. If you hit the notification bell, then you'll be able to catch up on parts 2 and 3 when they're released. Bye for now.